One of the changes in our recommendations has been recently to emphasize the possibility that interest rates will be going up rather than, as still so many mainstream economists and the Fed believe, going down. And one major near-term reason for that is the tariff policies of President Trump. In general, and I don't claim to be an expert on tariffs, but in general, I am supportive of what the president wishes to do on tariffs, which is to make a more fair trade policy between the United States and essentially all other countries, with particular emphasis on China. So that's a factor that's causing me to say, okay, long term, I like what tariffs are doing, but clearly, short term, some of the things that he has done, which I think probably are about the switching from one comment about tariffs and then changing and making, in many cases, multiple changes in policy, which is part of the Trump way of doing business. But that has shaken up the financial markets, particularly the mainstream American financial gurus, if you will, who long have taken the position and still are trying to take a position that the stock market is a good place to be. They've shaken those up. And perhaps the most important, in my mind, shakeup has to do not just with the stock market, but with the bond market. And if we take a look, for example, at the long term, the 30-year bond market, I've become increasingly interested in shorting that particular future as a way of preparing yourself to make money from higher interest rates. Why the 30-year T-bond? Well, the ability, whatever it is, which I am questioning, of the Federal Reserve to control interest rates is strongest in the near-term, short-term interest rates, like 90-day interest rates, because that's what they have control over in terms of the Fed funds. So the 30-year T-bond is going to be the area where the impact of the Fed is weakest. And what is the most important impact on which way the 30-year bond interest rates are going? I've continued to feel that that is what happens multiple times a week when the Treasury puts out their efforts, which have to be successful, literally have to be successful in order to avoid default by the country, put out their auctions for over $100 billion with a B dollars every week. And of course, part of the reasons those auctions are so big is because the national deficit for the year estimated, last I saw, at like another $2 trillion of national debt this year alone, which gets us from 36, it may be up to 37 trillion of federal debt. Maybe that gets us up to 38 or 9. And the reason that's so damaging, as the analyst Alistair MacLeod, whom those of you who read my newsletter will know I frequently include, is that when the rate of increase in the debt exceeds the rate of increase in economic growth potential, he uses a number of 3%, then he says this is a debt trap. And that, he would say, is what we're in for. I'm at the point where thinking that in large part because of interest rates, as interest rates go up, this will put more and more pressure on the government, that the ability of them to hold the line against what I think has to happen, which is not a small decrease in government spending, but at least the number, decrease government spending by at least $1 trillion. I think increasingly will have to be instituted by Congress. And the reason is that the longer they wait, the higher interest rates, I think, will go, and therefore the numbers on just how difficult it is for the financial system to deal with all of the debt will continue to grow. And perhaps the biggest single industry that is impacted is the banking industry. And one of the, in my opinion, major mistakes that we made is to allow banks that have huge losses based on interest rates going up and therefore bond prices going down, were allowed by the government to say, oh, well, that doesn't mean you're in default because we'll allow you from an accounting standpoint to treat the value of those bonds at 100%, what they'll be when they mature. And this, from anyone who has a knowledge of accounting, is the height of hypocrisy. And that's where the banking system, at least most banks, are faced. And that is going to cause defaults, or even worse, runs on the banks that will force the Federal Reserve to step in. And obviously, the closer we get to that situation, the more we can make money as speculators, both by continuing to be in the silver mining companies that we have continued to recommend, and also to be short things like the 30-year T-bond, and don't forget our long-term focus on supporting the purchase of puts in the enormous short-term interest rate market, the SOFR market. So that's where we stand, and I hope to have more information on what goes on with interest rates. But I guess my strongest comment to all investors, regardless of how conservative or liberal, is if you have any bond with a maturity of more than 2 years, sell them. For goodness sake, sell them to reduce your vulnerability to what happens to a portfolio when interest rates go up big time. I said that was my final comment, but that was my semi-final comment. My real final comment was, remember Paul Volcker, the Fed chairman, who under his policies, which I supported, broke the back of inflation just by reducing the growth of the money supply. But in order to do that and get the investment community to follow along, who at the time had said the Fed will never change it, they got interest rates on the same 30-year T-bond that now has an interest rate of still 4%. The number, I believe, was 15%. Think about it and be careful.